Thank you, Paul, for your introduction. I'm going to do a shorter talk just looking at some of the areas covered in my PhD. Most significantly, I'm going to talk about memory and schizophrenia and how abnormalities in memory might lead to the development of symptoms and the maintenance of those symptoms in the face of treatment. Specifically, there is a suggestion that problems in semantic memory, which I'll explain shortly, might be related to the development of both delusions and the symptom of thought disorder. So what I'm going to do is I'll talk a little bit about what we do know about memory and schizophrenia, and then I'm going to talk about what we think the relationship might be between memory and those specific psychotic symptoms. And towards the end of the talk, I'll also talk about a study we did where we gave people with no history of schizophrenia the drug ketamine to induce psychosis in those people to see if we could get those same semantic deficits and whether we could in fact create that relationship between delusions and thought disorder and memory deficits from this particular drug. The first point I think it's important to make is that not everyone with schizophrenia will experience significant memory problems. The data that I'm going to be talking about is sort of based on large groups of participants, and they report on the average memory function of that group. So some people with schizophrenia will complain and suffer from quite significant memory problems, and others will have no significant memory impairment at all. So that's just something to keep in mind if it starts to sound a little bit depressing at any point in terms of memory. Okay, so what the group data does tell us, generally speaking, is that schizophrenia is associated with difficulties in long-term memory, in both what we call episodic and semantic memory. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with those two separate memory systems, episodic memory is what we usually think of when we think about our memory. So, for example, when you remember your birthday party or you remember who you went to lunch with the other week, those kinds of memories are episodes or events personal to you. So they're sort of your unique memories. And what the data in schizophrenia tells us is that people often who have this disorder will have difficulties encoding or recording these memories to start with, and they'll also have some difficulty recalling this information offhand. What they are generally a lot better with is recognising the correct information. So you might say, well, what did you do last week? And sometimes might be a little bit confused. You say, did you do A or did you do B? They're much better at picking the appropriate response. So they often do have the memory in there. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to get at. So that's a very, very brief summary about what we know about episodic memory in schizophrenia. And I'm keeping that brief because the main area of interest of my PhD in this talk is what we call semantic memory. Now, semantic memory is quite different from episodic memory. It refers to your memory of meaning. It's also described as a general knowledge store. It contains factual information about the world that's quite separate from your personal experience. So we often share semantic type memories. So for example, we're accessing our semantic memory to know that the capital of Australia is Canberra. We use our semantic memory to know that the sun comes up in the day, and if we hear a barking four-legged furry animal, we can identify that as a dog because of information that we have in that semantic memory system. Now, we also find that people with schizophrenia do have deficits, sometimes subtle, but deficits in this system, and these seem to be implicated in certain symptoms, and I'll talk about that soon. I'm just going to give you a little bit more information about how semantic memory might work in our brains. It's thought that semantic memory is structured in a kind of network. So related information is stored closely together. So for example, the concept of cow will be connected to the concept of bull and calf and milk, and they'll be stored together in the network. The concept of fruit or house will be stored quite a bit further away from cow because it's not related to it. All right, now there are some important differences between episodic and semantic memory that are useful to know. First of all, it's easier to disrupt people's episodic memory, meaning it's easy to forget who you saw at the party the other week. It's harder to forget things like what a cow is. And there's a few theories as to why semantic memory is that bit more robust. It's thought that given semantic memory has lots of connections in the brain, so when you think of cow, that's related to milk, related to calf, those extra connections keep it sort of stronger memories. Another possible reason why it's so strong is because these semantic associations are often reaffirmed in everyday life. For example, if you buy a brand of milk that has a picture of a cow on it, every time you get that milk out and use it, you're reaffirming the relationship between cow and milk. So that keeps that system quite sturdy. Now, the reason that I point out the robustness in semantic memory is to emphasise how dramatic it is to have a deficit in this system, like the one that we do find in schizophrenia. The other important feature of semantic memory is we can use it to make logical inferences about the world. So, for example, if someone asks you, is a wrench a pet or is it a tool? You're able to work out that answer without necessarily ever having a conversation with someone where that's pointed out. So you don't have to have someone say to you one day, this is a wrench, it belongs to the category of tool, to work out that that's what it is. It's more like you look in your semantic memory, you look at what it takes to be a pet, you look at what it takes to be a tool, and you work out that a wrench fits in that tool category a lot better. So that logical deduction or inference system is really important to semantic memory, and it's thought to be related to how delusions can actually develop. I'll just tell you very briefly about what we know about the deficit in schizophrenia. First of all, this deficit appears to be present across cultures and in different languages, so it does appear to be significant in schizophrenia across the board to some degree. It's also thought to be a more, while we have sort of slight cognitive deficits in different areas can be found in schizophrenia, the one in memory seems to be more severe than the ones you might find in attention, for example. Also significant is by the time someone has their first psychotic episode or they receive their diagnosis, they probably already have some level of semantic deficit. So when we test people who've only just been given a diagnosis, there already seems to be maybe only subtle, maybe only slight, but some deficit in that system. And this is important from a theoretical point of view. So if we think problems in the semantic system lead to symptoms, then it's important that they might already be there before the symptoms occur. And finally, from a practical point of view, the worse someone's semantic function is, the greater their need is for social support. So it's really important that we do understand this system and what's going wrong with it from a remediation point of view. The next question might be, well, how do you know if someone's semantic system's not working? I mean, if someone's episodic memory's not working, you can just ask them what they did last week. You can ask them what your name is, that kind of thing. With semantic memory, we often have to be a little bit more creative. So one way you can test this system is to use what we call a sentence verification task. And a popular version of that task is called the silly sentence task. So in this task, you'll give people some statements and you'll ask them to say whether they're true or false. So for example, you might say to them, roses can be red. And most people would say, yeah, that's true enough. Some of the more bizarre sentences will be things like, politicians are sparrows, cactuses bite people, the Bible is a car catalogue, or blackbirds eat fingers. Now for most of us, these are obviously silly sounding and we can work out that they're false. But if you have a problem with that inference system, this isn't as easy. So think about that tool, wrench as a tool example. If you can't make that logical inference, how can you be sure that a blackbird doesn't eat fingers? And what we actually find is with people who've never had a diagnosis, they find this task very easy. They get 100% right or close to 100% right. And they also do it very quickly. What we find with people who have schizophrenia, especially those with delusions and thought disorders, is they'll have a little more trouble with this task. They'll often take a lot longer to answer these questions, and they're significantly more likely to agree with false statements like that politicians are sparrows. So that's a really nice task to show that you can make mistakes on what seems to be a very easy task if there is a problem with your ability to make inferences because of something going on in your semantic memory. Okay, another task we use to look at semantic memory, and this one's quite ingenious, is called the semantic priming task. So we think about that network again with our related information stored closely together. Now, as a general rule, if you show people two words, one after the other, they will recognise the second word a lot faster if it's related to the first word. So, for example, you will recognise calf if it comes after cow, or bull if it comes after cow, much faster than you'll recognise fruit if that comes after cow, because they're less related and they're further away from each other in the network. Now, this faster response to related pairs is known as a priming effect. This priming effect is healthy because when you think about a topic, it's useful to have related information close at hand. It's not useful to have random or distant thoughts interfering with your current thought process, which is what we think might be happening for some people with schizophrenia. Now, the evidence suggests that in schizophrenia, our natural inhibition system that prevents that unrelated information from interfering with our thoughts might be dysfunctional. As a result, people with schizophrenia often suffer from confusing thoughts and unusual thought patterns. And we can demonstrate this difficulty using a task like the priming one. So in the task, we might have those related pairs like cow and bull, and we might have the pairs like cow and fruit that are unrelated. But we can also introduce what we call indirect pairs. So what about bull and calf? They're sort of indirectly related because they're both associated with the idea of a cow. Now, for people whose semantic memory is intact, they will have that faster priming effect to cow-calf, but they'll have a very minor or no significant priming for those indirect tasks. What we do find, and this is a really robust finding that's been supported by meta-analysis and review, is that schizophrenia people are much more likely to have significant indirect priming. And this is thought to demonstrate that failure of inhibition in the system. So it's not inhibiting those less related words, in which case you're more likely to prime to them.